Hello and welcome to Novara FM, brought to you by Novara Media and broadcast on Resonance 104.4 FM. I'm James Butler. This Saturday we'll see a demonstration of the far-right DFLA, the so-called Democratic Football Lads Alliance, as they attempt to march through central London. So at the top of the show I want to say anti-fascist organisers have called a march and a rally to oppose them and to prevent them from marching. That's a mass rally at Old Palace Yard from 1 p.m, as well as a unity march organised by the Anti-Fascist Network, leaving from the BBC building in Portland Place from midday. You can find further details of those demonstrations on the Novara Media Facebook and Twitter, which, of course, you should be following. Are we seeing a resurgence of the far right in this country? Alongside groups like the DFLA, Tommy Robinson, the leader of the EDL, has made himself into a YouTube star and free speech martyr, hooking himself into a burgeoning global right-wing movement, stretching from Hungary's Viktor Orbán to Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro to the ever-oozing Steve Bannon. But what is the history of far-right organisation in the UK? How have fascists in the UK sought to take the streets and to take political power? How have they been stopped before? Joining me to discuss these questions is David Renton, author of several books on fascism, dissident Marxism and globalisation, and who is working on a volume titled The New Authoritarians, Convergence on the Right, which will touch on precisely these themes. So I wonder if we can start by, obviously there's an upsurge, or we see an upsurge in the far right in this country. And one that I think is probably pretty distinctive in its organising methods from sort of previous iterations of the far right, of the fascists of yesteryear. So maybe it's useful to begin with a sense of what forms fascist organising in the far right has taken in the UK in the past, both pre and post World War II, because I think that's probably quite an important distinction.
Okay, well, the fascism starts in Britain in around 1920. The first organisation is called the British Fascists, also British Fascisti. That survives for a few years. Recruits Lord Haw, Joyce. But essentially it's a group of aristocrats at the fringes of the Conservative Party, and it dies pretty fast. From then, between about 1934, give or take, and about 1960, give or take, the main form of fascism in this country is Oswald Mosley, the British Union Fascist, later known as the just British Union, changed name again after the war to the Union movement. That's much more like a classical fascist party. It tries to emerge on the streets. It has support sometimes, for example, from Daily Mail, as everyone knows. And it carries on post-Second World War, weirdly, with a very distinctive ideology of its own, all about the benefits of European Union. Don't know if I want to get into that. It's a bit of a sidetrack. Then there's a period where things are dominated by kind of Nazi revivalist groups, key figures Colin Jordan, John Tyndall. Then in 1967, these two things emerge in a kind of attempt to bring all the different bits of the extra-parliamentary right together with the National Front. That suffers significant knockbacks at the end of the 60s, gives rise then to the BNP, which is essentially the same model. Coming up to today, the number one thing I think to take on board about the far right in Britain today is it emerges in a sense with an unspoken but real critique of that history. People like Tommy Robinson, the DFLA, they don't want to create a fascist party. They don't want to be a top-down organisation. They don't even particularly want to be a political party. And they certainly don't think that the way to get mass support in Britain these days is by telling everyone how misunderstood Hitler was.
So if we're thinking of the kind of pre-Tommy Robinson period, there's certainly, you mentioned the kind of strangely European trend of some of this stuff, and I suppose there's something that recurs again and again, which is the question of sort of Europeanness, and which is slightly distinct, I think, from what the fascists were doing there. There's also, I think, for Mosley, a kind of a focus, and maybe it's not talked about as much these days, but a real focus on empire on the importance of empire. And that seems to me that's something that's definitely recurrent again now. It's sort of funny, as we're recording today, there's been an announcement from Jeremy Corbyn saying, we should teach why slavery is bad, which has provoked the kind of typical, actually, we gave them railways and other such things. But so alongside that history, obviously there's a history of resistance to fascism as well. I wonder if you can tell me a bit about what forms that took before the kind of stuff that we're familiar with. So I think the two touchstones, we have a Cable Street and maybe Wood Green and Lewisham in the 70s. What else is going on over the course of these kind of transmutations of the far right?
Okay, before you have Cable Street, there are all sorts of early initial attempts to set up anti-fascist groups, to develop anti-fascist theory. There are, Joyce is famously confronted. What everyone knows about him for the Second World War is he's got these distinctive marks on all over his face, really terrible scars. He got them in a fight where fascists attacked a left-wing meeting in the mid-1920s. So there are sort of initial clashes and lots of sort of acronyms of little groups which die very quickly, up to about 1930. Cable Street isn't the only thing that happens in the 30s. There's also, just as important, is Olympia in 1934, which comes actually when Mosley's at the peak of his movement, with something like 40 or 50,000 supporters. They try and hold a huge mass rally in Olympia, in the centre of London, and get tens of thousands of people in the room. Fascists don't go along there, anti-fascists don't go along there trying to drive the right off the streets. Actually, people go there with the strategy of confronting the fascists, knowing that they may well take a physical beating, which they do. And it's that violence which knocks Mosley's movement, just in terms of its membership, from a peak of 40 or 50,000 members down to at most 10,000 a year later. And it's actually the biggest single setback that British fascism suffers on the streets at any point. And the way it pans out is much more like, say, Charlottesville last year in America, that it's the far right comes there, overarmed for the conflict. And that slightly disappeared out of left-wing stories of the 30s. In terms of from then up to the 1970s, I think many listeners will have heard of the 43 group, Jewish paramilitaries, Jewish militaries, people who served in the Second World War, probably more Communist Party influenced than classic accounts, for example, Maurice Beckman's book, really reveal. And then there's success to them, the 62 group, which carries on a strategy of information gathering, has its descendants today in Searchlight and Hope Not Hate, who come from that tradition. One thing you alluded to, which is interesting, which again often gets missed out, is that the far right equips itself with this sort of colonial story. So alongside the Mosleyites, in the 50s and 60s, the main far right thing which is going on is the League of Empire Loyalists, who are a group of people nostalgists for the empire. Largely, they don't live in Britain, but they're giving money from exile to the far right in Britain. Again, that feels very contemporary. We think about Brexit. In terms of what the left does, I don't think the left ever really has a strategy for dealing with these people, because they're small numbers, they do stunts, they heckle the Prime Minister. It's very hard to know what they're going to do beforehand. But it kind of leaves a bit of a residue in the 70s, in that for quite a lot of the 70s, the organisation, which is perceived as the group that can take an initial lead on anti-racist and anti-fascist work in this country, is Liberation, which is the Communist Party's, at various times also called Movement for Colonial Freedom. So there's the idea that's naturally the opposite pole to the League of Empire Loyalists, even if people never really work out how to make that work in practice.
So I wonder, because we saw during the Labour Party conference, Emily Thornberry chanting "No pass around" from her lectern and sort of lauding the role of the Labour Party historically in anti-fascism, which I have to say was news to me. Partly because the Labour Party, it seems, has always been playing catch-up on this stuff. And you alluded there to the Communist Party. I wonder if you could say a bit about the role of those kind of large party political formations in anti-fascist struggle.
Well, when I saw Emily Thornberry's speech, what it made me think of was Cable Street and who turned out people at Cable Street. And there's just absolutely no way that you can say in retrospect, oh, it was the Labour Party who was there, it was the Labour Party who delivered the numbers. That's just really not true. The Labour Party, obviously Cable Street was 4th of October 1936. The Labour Party conference is very shortly afterwards. And the whole line which comes out of conference in 36 is denouncing the demonstration, saying that it shouldn't have happened, and calling for more powers to the police to prevent two sets of bad extremists from mobilising. So it's kind of nice that people want to claim the memory of that event, but it's not that honest. I suppose one way of looking at the question is essentially this, that at every time on the left that a group has wanted to be the major force in terms of outside Labour politics, often the way it's done that is by saying we're the best anti-fascists, and that's often been a strategy by which groups claim moral legitimacy within the left. So generally, at most moments, most actual organising is done by that group, whatever it is, which is largest and most dynamic outside the Labour Party.
And the Communist Party was one of the groups that claimed that mantle, I suppose, at one time. I mean, certainly more recently I see, and actually in the run-up to the forthcoming anti-DFLA march this weekend, I see the kind of, it seems to me to be like a thing that happens again and again, right? Which is that, the claim this time is that, people have been sucked into organising the Labour Party, which is why they don't do good militant anti-fascism anymore. In the past, that, was often, you'd have arguments over whether United Against Fascism was doing the proper work of confrontation, stuff like that. So these things seem to me to be pretty recurrent. I wonder how far it's, this is a reasonable critique to level at the way these things are organised.
I don't know. I mean, to be honest, my sense is on the left is there's generally been a division of Labour and people have been pretty comfortable with it. The communists were not particularly wandering around going, how dare the Labour Party denounce us? What they wanted the Labour Party to do was when Mosley was standing in elections in the East End in 1937, they wanted the Labour Party to have good left-wing candidates who'd make sure the British Union fascist votes would be terrible. Communist Party deserves the credit for 36 because they turned the people out, and that led to a long period of communist mass support in that particular area. Of course, just 10 years later, the MP for part of the East End, Phil Pratt's a communist.
Yeah.
In terms of the idea that people are being sucked out of anti-fascism into Labour Party work, I don't know, that seems pretty stupid to me. I don't know if we want to get into it. I mean,
fair enough. Yeah,
I'm not a member of the Labour Party. I don't share that critique at all. I think what we need in the moment is we need the Labour Party that's going to respond to the far right, which is going to grow stronger and in an electoral way over the next year. And that's really what we need Corbyn to do. Have demonstrations been small because the Labour Party failed to turn people out? I don't know. My hunch is that may reflect a slightly unrealistic notion of how the Labour Party works. So there's this sort of button, this big red button in the leader's summer office, and he presses it, and by command process, hundreds of thousands of people diligently appear on the streets. I think it's a bit harder than that.
So let's talk about those mass mobilisations then, and particularly the 1970s, where the kind of mass mobilisations, especially in Lewisham, have become a real kind of touchstone, or almost part of the anti-fascist mythos, the heritage, the way in which anti-fascists talk or think about, often the way in which the contemporary movement is lacking. So sometimes it gets talked about as involving enormous amounts of community organisation. Sometimes it paints a picture of quite a militant trade union background to it. How did it actually happen?
Well, in terms of Lewisham, in a sense, it's actually it's not hugely easy to say. One of the reasons why Lewisham was a success is that all the various fractions of the far left turned out in a very similar way to the ways they did right throughout the 1970s. but they reached an echo in that local community. And when they reached that echo, they were able to turn out so that the balance of forces between the left and the right were considerably to the favour of the left. So that there are different estimates of how many people were there, but let's say around 5,000-6,000 anti-fascists, let's say around 1,000 supporters of the National Front, maybe even slightly fewer. So there's a significant numerical advantage in a particular tightly packed geographical area. Now, how is it that the left's able to get so much credibility in that area? And the truth to say is that no matter how many people you interview, no matter how many times you speak to the people who did the work, it's still slightly mysterious. The things which I've found striking when I've tried to research the story, number one, is that some of the local activists who were determined to make Lewisham work were people who came from military backgrounds. They were organising for this. They were people who'd been reservists, who'd been court-martialed, who'd been involved in, had gone along to things like 68 and the period afterwards in Derry. They'd come out of all those experiences and they're really, really, really prepared to think, we want this confrontation to end in a physical victory. Another thing I find striking is that they were in the local area for 3 or 4 months beforehand. The people who instigated the idea of an anti-NF protest were overwhelmingly white. They were in Lewisham, a largely black area. They were relying on a generation of young black people. They didn't just go there for a period of 2 or 3 weeks, but they were in the area for 3 or 4 months before. There were a bunch of black activists who were also taking up the call. I'd love to be able to say that, for example, they latched on to local traditions of community organising, which have been present there for some months and years, in the way that they definitely had at Southall, which was the other big event in the 1970s. I don't think actually that's true. I mean, there were groups like Race Today, which were in the local area a bit, but when you talk to key activists, they really don't try to say, oh yeah, we went to this mass meeting and that delivered the audience. I think one of the things which really, really helped, oddly enough, is this, and it's not something people focus on, but I think it's interesting. The left was opposing the National Front, who were calling a demonstration around mugging and saying that they were opposed to black youth mugging white people in the area. On the left side, there were a bunch of young people who'd been arrested, and there were families around whom the left was able to build a defence campaign, which was kind of the seed and genesis of the Lewisham protests. On the right side of the fence, although the NF had, in a sense, an emotive issue around which to build locally, they never had an individual. They didn't have a family who'd been mugged, they didn't have a victim, and there was no way they could make that story concrete and compelling to people locally. And I think that's one of the reasons why the left, as it were, able to get a breakthrough, because of a particular relationship around somebody who's been the victim of a police arrest, Christopher Foster and his family. That gives them a credibility locally, which the NF doesn't have in the run-up to the demo.
Post-Lewisham, we have, I think, and it's something that sounds very familiar, in comparison to what happened post-Olympia, is you have kind of cyclical violence, you have continuing street confrontations, but also I think I'm right in saying the NF gradually sort of loses any kind of political credibility, right? So it begins to split, you get the emergence of the BNP, you get, I think some people, see the rise of Thatcher and split off to the Tory party. So, when we take out those kind of key flashpoints, is that the story of anti-fascism in one sense, is actually provoking the right to lose that kind of that guise of credibility on the one hand, and the sort of strategic ambiguity that they have with relation to the electoral process, with relation to what they actually believe?
I think that's right. I mean, one of the things people forget, the National Front's founded in 1967. It takes off in 1968, and it takes off because of a very significant Conservative politician announcing his opposition to immigration, Enoch Powell, the Rivers of Blood speech. 10 years later, you get Margaret Thatcher doing a very similar manoeuvre with her swamping remarks. One gives the National Front an enormous boost, one leads actually the National Front crumbling. And I think you're exactly right to say that the difference between those two is that the National Front is an unknown force on the first occasion. Powell isn't able to bank all this massive support he has. It has a phrase historians of fascism often use, is a reputational shield. By the late 70s, that reputational shield has gone, and it's that which means that Thatcher has that effect. I'm not suggesting that in general, and I think it's really a bad idea to think that the far right was defeated in the 70s because of Thatcher's speech. We've just seen again and again over the past 40 years so many different politicians in so many different European countries trying to, as it were, outflank the far right by being tougher than. We know that in most circumstances the move fails. The move unusually succeeds, but it succeeds because of the mass movement.
Some of the stuff you say about one of the reasons that, the front failed there, in comparison to the left having these kind of very concrete figures, a name and a face and a person to stick on what are abstract arguments, reminds me somewhat uncomfortably of today, where there is a very clear face and a name and a story of persecution and oppression by mysterious forces, whether they're the establishment, the state, George Soros possibly, and that's Tommy Robinson. Is this something you think they've consciously learned from?
I don't think it's learned. I think that Tommy Robinson's a very interesting and effective political figure. I think that his approaches are intuitive. He sees what works and he backs off with things which don't work. He very often tries 4 or 5 different political strategies at once. One of his successes is both to try things fast, move away from them before they hang around and cause some long-term damage. So I don't think that it's learned or it's conscious, but I think as a description of what's going on, that's right. But then again, I think it raises an interesting question, which, because I often meet with different people on the left and we often just bounce ideas together, and we often talk about, what would a clever and effective left-wing anti-fascist strategy look like right at the present? One of the things I find that's really extraordinary is I think that on our side, we're letting Tommy Robinson get away with the argument that somehow he is standing up for the victims of sexual abuse, that somehow he has a record of protecting people from sexual abuse. And I think one of the particular things we've really failed to do is people have never gone back to these stories and said, all right, in this local area, there was a scandal. All right, who broke the news of the scandal? Who was the whistleblower? Who was the person who stood by the women when they were absolutely in the worst possible state and being disbelieved and ignored and so on? Can we go to that person and we can use those people with that credibility to, as it were, overreach Robinson? And it's something which, if people listening have any idea how practically to do that, have contacts, whatever, it's always one thing I'm always trying to listen out for, because it seems to me that concreteness that's around Robinson is actually quite vulnerable. It's an extremely bogus and shallow claim that actually he's done anything for any of these victims. And
I suppose we can make the argument that he endangers them, right? I mean, that's part of his contempt of court charge was exactly about that.
Yeah, I mean, when I was listening in on the appeal in the High Court, and one of the moments when Robinson's lawyers were really squirming was when it was pointed out that in the Leeds trial, one of the practical effects of his intervention had been that the people who'd been accused, people who'd been convicted of various crimes, they were now appealing. And one of their specific appeal grounds was that they couldn't have a fair trial because of his intervention. Now, who's to say how that argument's going to go in the courts in 3 or 6 months' time? But if that was to come out, I think that'd be something that even he and his supporters would find, absolutely unforgivable.
Yeah, I mean, I think very similarly about some of the left responses to this stuff, and I very often wonder if there's something that the left doesn't do correctly, where it sort of cedes, perhaps unconsciously, perhaps it's just because it's something they don't, we don't want to touch, and whether we cede the ground to a kind of racism that says, well, maybe it is endemic in these communities, in that same way of accepting what is the kind of propositional logic behind it. and therefore find ourselves unable to challenge it. I think there are good and legitimate ways to challenge it. It's largely through feminism, through questions of patriarchy, how these things arise in practice.
Yeah.
So that's a good strategic point, I think. I just want to think a bit about then that difference between what the ideological core of fascism proper is. And I know it's a vexed question, and maybe it can tell us some stuff about what's so different about these kind of contemporary movements, because that question of what fascism means in historical terms, there's certainly things that are no longer visible on the far right, not least of which is the existence of private militias, but it also has, I think, maybe an anti-democratic cast historically. That's less the case now. So what is the if you were to pin down the core of fascist belief historically, where would you locate it?
I think the starting point, even before I answer that question directly, is to say something which I think people miss, which is that for me, fascism is a kind of praxis. I know that's not a word which we like using on the left about other forces, but it's when we talk about ourselves. Often we talk about ideas on the far left, for example, Marxism. We see Marxism as praxis, a theoretically informed practice, and we have an idea that even if within some bit or other of the tradition there's some strange idea or whatever, there's a core to it, and that core actively shapes people's decisions and enables them to take politics in a revolutionary direction. Now, if you see that process and try imagining it through a mirror, think that maybe the far right can have praxis too. Now, for me, 20 years ago, I wrote a book for Pluto about what fascism was, and the sentence which I tried to come up with, which concentrated it down, was the idea that fascism is a specific form of reactionary mass movement. And there's sort of two ideas there which are intended to be in tension. One is that fascism, in the same way that on the left, we have our notion of socialism as a progressive mass movement. In other words, it doesn't necessarily try to have a revolution, but it tries to move society in a social democratic direction. It means the NHS. It means voting. It means free education. It means a mass of things which transform society slowly in the direction of the great majority of people. That's what we mean by progressive. Fascism, it doesn't. At this point, its negation isn't Marxism. At this point, its negation is actually ordinary social democracy. Fascism wants to strip all of those out. It wants to take out all the reforms, any possibility of a different political economy which points away from the present. It wants to break all of that, destroy all of that. But the interesting thing about fascism is because actually there have been lots of different kinds of reactionary politics in history. And most times they originate within conventional parties of the centre-right. Or they arise within things which always, or very often back up the right, certain forms of religion, certain forms of military rule, and so on. Fascism is different from them in that it originates outside them, to some extent against them, and demands the backing of the greatest number of people for its reactionary goals. Now, this makes it chaotic. It means it can only really emerge in situations of white-hot political crisis. But it sets itself, in a sense, as a sort of counter-revolutionary form of political practice, which is almost exactly the opposite of what we see on the core ideological bits of the left is doing. It does, for the far right, what things like Marxism do for the far left. Now, if we see it like that, then one of the things I've been trying to argue for several months and years to people on the left is it's just a political category error to see either Tommy Robinson or indeed this general phenomenon we have of electoral far rights doing really well electorally in lots of countries, to see them as fascist. Mm-hmm. They're not setting out to strip out society. I mean, you talked about democracy. It's really social democracy. They're not trying to strip out all the different reforms. Le Pen in France is not saying that she will remove the French welfare state. And they don't see themselves as being sort of revolutionaries on the right in the way that fascists did. They're electoral people on the right. And the move that's really going on, as I see it, is that you're seeing a reconstitution of the right. I use the word convergence to describe different forces coming together a mixture of electoral and anti-electoral people in what ought to be a completely inappropriate and unholy alliance of different political categories that normally don't get on. They come together, and they're coming on at a slightly but significantly different place from fascism.
It's interesting. So do you lend any credence to that there is a kind of porousness on the right? Because, we're talking about that kind of back and forth with, the NF and the hard right of the Tory party. And it's certainly something, I guess, that preoccupies because for those of us, who've been involved in anti-fascist organising in the past, I often found myself very uncomfortable when people would talk about, and I know it was an argument that was very live in, say, the student movement in the 80s. It's like, how far does no platform go? How far is this an appropriate tactic to use against, out-and-out fascists? How far does it extend to reactionaries elsewhere? And just emerging out of that practice, the thing that was most difficult for me there was actually determining, and sure, hard cases make bad law, but where that boundary line is and what the nature of that boundary line is.
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is that whether there's a boundary or not is something which varies over time. I got involved in left-wing politics at the end of the 1980s. First really was doing stuff in the early 1990s. And to my mind, if you look back in retrospect, the early 1990s, it was actually really very clear. There was an electoral right, the Conservatives. There was a party, the British National Party, which was trying to copy various Euro-fascist electoral initiatives by parties which had been founded by fascists. So it was the same place politically as the MSI in Italy, the FN in France. There was a very large gulf between those two things. You could, if you wanted to, say that the Tory party even then was slightly porous at its edges. Well, maybe. I think 99 out of 100 times it was pretty obvious where everyone stood. But if you compare that to today, and particularly, I think you see Britain as being relatively unusual in that because of first past the post, we still have a political system which looks a lot like, in terms of the formal politics, it looks a lot like politics did 30 years ago, and because people discount UKIP and try and think it out of the equation. But in Britain, that kind of still just about works, particularly because UKIP's in a bad way. Although, of course, it's been picking up since the Chequers deal. But now try and think about it electorally. Try and think about it internationally. How do you place someone like Donald Trump? Donald Trump's electorate, his voting base, is exactly the same as the Republican voting base in every election for the last 5 years. By far, the last 5 rounds, by far the best indicator of how people voted in the 2016 election was how they'd voted before. You were getting essentially 90% of registered Republicans who voted Republican, and essentially 90% of registered Democrats who voted Democrat. So that there's absolute continuity in the voting base. And yet Trump's chief strategist was Steve Bannon, someone who's written several occasions now about Julius Evola and his admiration for a kind of fascism, who's post-war fascism, whose only critique of Mussolini was that Mussolini wasn't racist and violent enough. So, Trump doesn't fit into all our collective mindsets of there's a right and it's in one place, there's a far right, it's in another place. There's been a breaking down of certain walls and boundaries, and the more you look internationally throughout Europe, the more obvious that is. I suppose one thing to think about, you use the word porousness. One thing to think about is gatekeeping. Maybe I was trying to think about what's the defining feature of politics in our moment. Arguably, the defining feature of politics, of global politics in the last 5 years, because gatekeeping is the opposite of porousness, is, of course, there's been convergence on the left too. Corbyn makes sense as a left-wing convergence project. But generally, internationally, the gatekeeping by the soft left has been effective. Yeah. And generally, internationally, the gatekeeping by the soft right has failed.
I wonder, I was really struck by a speech Viktor Orban gave where he talked about anti-liberal democracy as being a phrase that unites some of this stuff, not all of it, but some of it. And that struck me as one of the kind of preoccupations, I think, of this convergence. The other thing that really struck me was how far many of these people, so from Orban to Bannon to Tommy Robinson, are preoccupied with something they call globalism, which seems to me to be very unclear, and it has that usefulness of a sort of empty signifier, is that it can mean whatever it's useful to mean at the time. Do you have a sense of what of a bit where that comes from on the right?
I think historically the two main moments in recent years which energised the right, one plainly is September the 11th and the whole anti-Muslim stuff. Beyond that, and that that motivates a lot of the anti-liberalism. Liberalism is wrong because it hasn't been muscular enough in its response to Muslims. But I think the other thing's the 2008 banking crisis. Globalism is, I suppose, a way of saying that the banks and so on, they have some sort of relationship with the political parties, and that's essentially what's wrong with capitalism. And it's got a shifting register. Sometimes it's just a code. It means Jews. It means Soros and behind him. It means all the old anti-Semitism. Sometimes it means, for example, Trump has a different notion in terms of what's needed is a turn to economic nationalism. It's not the case that that's been a unifying trend within the right internationally. Lots of far rightists actually don't particularly agree with him on that.
One of the things that becomes clear, in terms of people's anxieties about the street movements here, and so not just Tommy Robinson, but the DFLA and all the sort of various predecessors it has, one of which, of course, is the EDL. There's an anxiety, I think, on the left, and it's certainly visible when I read discussions about it, is that they are more authentically working class than the left, and have a better sense of how to reach out to a working class that's somehow out there, that the left doesn't touch. And this, I guess, it's kind of a step away from, there are old left cliches about, analytical cliches about fascism being predominantly middle class or having, a kind of cross-class basis. How far is that a real reading of this kind of movement, that it is predominantly working class and that it is primarily located there?
I don't like this left. I don't like the left. I know it's not really what you're aiming at, but I don't like the left idea, which tries to say that fascism is always a recurrent ideology of the middle class. One of the reasons why I don't like it is because if you actually care about historical models and you care about what happened in the 30s, the main professional groups which turned towards fascism in the 1930s were doctors, were by far the largest number of people. The main non-occupational group was students. We're not worried in Britain about a movement of doctors and students. We just aren't. I think it probably is the case that a couple of things have happened which are uncomfortable, but I think we've got to acknowledge them. One of the things which has happened is that even in my own lifetime, the far left, by which I don't just mean outside Labour Party, I mean far left, including things which in the Labour Party would be called the hard left or whatever, generally groups are more middle class than they were 30 or 40 years ago. Strike days are something like 5 or 10% of what they were 30 years ago. So the points at which the left historically had to bring people into the movement, a lot of that relationship's been lost. Now that casts light on the support for the EDL, DFLA and so on. I think they are more successful outside the bigger cities. I think they're more successful in poorer areas. When sociologists do research in those communities and look for far-right activists, they find them quite easily. And when they look for far-left activists, they don't. A lot of us were hoping, for example, when Corbyn came in, that he'd have a particular success relating to that audience. I think he's had some success, but I don't think that he's by himself has been enough to reverse the routes they've got. I don't people to get miserable about that or to go, oh my God, we're all bound to lose. I mean, the left has faced this problem before, and amongst its strategies for dealing with it has always been to try and recruit in working class communities around anti-fascist politics. But I think we do need to see that we're at the start of a process about pushing back at the likes of Robinson, and we're a very long way away from a victory point.
What do you make then in that context? Is I was quite struck by the post-Labour Party conference, the party political broadcast that went. I don't know if you've seen it. It's really focused on towns, our town. It has, it's got like very clear messages, which are amenable to anti-fascism, but also talks about sort of taking back control locally. It's almost, it's really pushing, that kind of strategic line. And so that to me, rang, a hopeful bell. There's it's got a slight cheesiness to it, to someone like me, but, whatever. But that sense of, promising actual control over your lives and so on and so on, that seems to me to be a very promising avenue to go down.
Yeah, look, I totally agree. I thought there was a very sharp piece in this week's London Review of Books. The author was talking about different things. He was talking about Brexit, but the same reasoning applies here. He says we're in a moment where one of the things about the right, and one of the reasons why it appeals, is it constantly provides this story, which is the story, he compares it to St. George and the Dragon. So you've got an embattled community which has to unite against the threat. Now, the threat is imaginary. The threat is foreigners, the threat is the EU, the threat is whatever. But the right is always telling a story which brings people together. And he compares it to the left in this moment. He says the problem with the left is that the left, our imaginary, is something like Billy Elliot. It's the story of people coming out of a working class community through education, through culture, and then disappearing from it forever. In other words, all their stories are stories which unite people, even on a mythic basis, whereas all our stories are stories which ultimately divide people. Now, I spent ages trying to think, well, what's the answer to that? And the thought that occurred to me is maybe the author's wrong, because maybe he doesn't see what happened to Billy Elliot after the film ends. Well, Billy Elliot's living in a city. And Billy Elliot's living in a city surrounded by a whole bunch of other people who have to create new forms of solidarity based on where they find themselves. And they find themselves, white people, black people, every single different descriptor in an area trying to recreate solidarity new. So it seemed to me that maybe the way out of that dilemma is the notion of a city as a place where people come together and are together against austerity, etc., etc., etc. And maybe that's the thing which trumps and gets us out of this process, that we're just telling stories which always divide people. Maybe that's the way to do it.
But I mean, on that basis, it is pretty clear to me that those myths, the imaginary monster, is a very powerful one. And I go back and forth on these questions about how it's best tackled, because there's something I find difficult about any talk of a reclaiming Englishness or alternative Englishness. However fond I am of the Levellers, however fond I am of the various defeated causes throughout English history, it doesn't seem to me that there's much hope there. And yet at the same time, constructing arguments that are not nationalist, but are capable of speaking to, the people's collective identities, does seem to me to be something that we shy away from. Is it possible to go into that stuff without kind of flirting with the sort of, Celtic revival, semi-fascist? Isn't the BNP once run a sort of strange sort of Celtic mysticism gift shop? I remember it.
I'm not sure if I remember that. But there's been a lot of that on the far over the years. Italian fascists getting into Tolkien and the Hobbits and so on. I think it's possible to do it. A small anecdote, but I think it goes to something. I was born in 1972. In that year, the only time in British history of the students who did history at A level, a majority did not do ordinary history. A majority chose instead to do economic and social history. Now, why would that option be? What would it mean? I think what they were doing was essentially an A-level in E.P. Thompson studies. And the reason why that seemed more viable and more attractive as just teaching history to tens of thousands of people was actually the story of Britain. Britain was an overwhelmingly working-class country which had been formed by being the first country in the world to undergo industrialisation. And that was Britain's gift to the world, was that because we'd industrialised first, we'd just thought through all the things which have to follow from industrialisation, e.g. a mass welfare system. So that actually was the story of Britain. But the story of Britain was the story of economic and social history. No one particularly felt a need to say, all right, this has got to be in a circuit which begins, there's the nation at one point ruled by these good people, all these bad people, and then there's a switch, and that's what we're describing. It was enough to describe literally the emergence of the working class as the mass movement, and that was the national story. Now, whether that narrative can be equally compelling, again, I'm not pretending it is. I say, I mean, it seems to me that the gamble we have to wage our future on is much more on the notion of the city and the solidarity of people who come together in a place, but that place isn't the nation. That seems to me is a more hopeful story. But either of those routes, either what people were doing 45 years ago or my suggestion for today, they don't begin and end with, Billy Bragg singing Jerusalem or whatever it is. And, someone going, I do like the new manager of the England football team who has a nice line in waistcoats. We don't need to do it like that.
Yeah. I mean, so one of the things that I guess has always surprised me about the kind of ideological transformations on the right was something that doesn't seem to have emerged as strongly as one might think it would post-2008, is a kind of Strasserite, attempt at a sort of anti-austerity movement, but, also racist. And I wonder, why hasn't that happened? Why is there not, a really clear attempt to focus that politics around that kind of very clear and burning issue?
Well, look, first, it's not going to be Strasser because with each generation of the far right, they do choose individuals who are just a bit further away from the fascist core. That's why, the name that comes up repeatedly at the moment is Zola rather than Strasser. But in terms of what you're describing, the broad outlines of what you're describing, actually, it's exactly what's happened. If the focus is on the electoral right, it seems to me that the overwhelming message of the electoral right internationally is we can deliver for the great majority of people because we're in a moment of austerity and cuts. And we have an alternative to austerity and cuts, which is to keep the foreigners out. If we keep the foreigners out, then you can maintain the welfare state. Now, this isn't quite as militant or as radical as Strasserism, which, was a kind of like Trotskyism of the far right with its kind of betrayal myth about how terrible Hitler was. But its shape and its logic is exactly the same. The reason why it emerges in this particular form really is austerity. That it's because the left is in power in 2008 in Britain and the US when austerity is introduced. The left never really has until the last couple of years a coherent response to austerity. So what happens in essence is the right, as it were, evolves its own more radical alternative to austerity. It starts off with austerity. It knows it can be a popular argument for some time. It realises it's starting to lose its vote. And then it goes in a more racial welfareist direction to avoid that happening. But that's what the last 10 years. So
that's sort of Denmark, I think. I don't know if the Støjberg's law in the sort of post, in the last, I think, 3 years, you see, the desire to, kind of these kind of obviously punitive laws about taking jewellery off refugees and stuff like that. But basically, there being this sense that the welfare state is something that has been very difficult to achieve, and that is concomitantly very, very fragile. Now, it seems to me quite different to someone like Orban, who might talk about, the consequences of global capitalism, but doesn't do it in such a way that, that says that we could have a kind of nice, smiley, redistributive project here, were it not for, I don't know, Soros or whatever, So I wonder about that. How far these kind of right-wing social security politics can make inroads.
Well, look, I think they are making inroads, and they're why the far right's doing so well internationally. You're right about Orban, but of course Orban originates a generation before all the figures today. He originates in 2008 because of Hungary, because of the mortgage crisis, because people are going to lose their homes, and that's the killer argument he has against the previous Liberal governments. In terms of the far right now, the sorts of people I'm thinking of, Fortuyn, with his argument that it's either, I'm actually quoting him now, it's either immigration it's either welfare benefits or immigration control. It's either get that right. It's either the welfare state or no foreigners. You can't have both. I'm thinking, for example, of France, an idea of national preference to the FN. I'm thinking even of Britain. I mean, and again, with the point I've already made, that Britain, despite Brexit, hasn't gone quite as far down this route as other European countries. But that notion of making people pay NHS fees, I think that was a really significant piece of politics. And remember, of course, that we've seen it twice. Firstly, for people who the Home Office accepts have the right to be here, for whom the charges are relatively modest, such as several £100 a year. But for me, that was the really striking thing about the Windrush scandal, is you looked at how that policy is used against people who do have the right to be here but are wrongly believed not to, and then the amounts of money they were being potentially having to pay, £50,000 for cancer treatment. That's not just a story in that person's lives. That's a symbolic break with the kind of doing welfare politics.
Yes, I think I'd agree. I just want to talk, I guess, a bit about tactics then, because it seems to me that there's a political question here about universalism, about solidarity, about making a case that actually our capacity to build a politics of this kind isn't fragile, actually, and that it doesn't lead to parasitism or exploitation by a sort of foreign body. But it also, that's the political question in one sense. The tactical question then seems to me about, one, the resurgence of a street movement and whether our tactics up to now have been correct in dealing with that. But then two, the ideological question that seems to circulate around this stuff, which is free speech. And I think that to me has been really the most interesting, most difficult question in some ways, right? Is not ceding the terrain on free speech. Because I thought it was extremely interesting. I was watching Channel 4 package on one of the Free Tommy demos, and you had a woman there, and as always with this stuff, who knows whether she's being sincere, who knows what she's saying. I'm on the demo not because I really agree with this stuff, but because of free speech. He's a free speech martyr. And she was pointing, because when it had kicked off, she pointed down the road and go, I think that's wrong. But she was there because of free speech. So in this kind of situation, this conjuncture, UK conjuncture, what are the kind of tactical insights we can draw from the past, and what has maybe outlived its usefulness?
Look, I'm not someone who tries to, in advance of successful mass movements, say they should do X or they should do Y. I think you need to look and from what's happened and what's worked, and try and think about why it's worked and where it's therefore whether it's generalisable. Two things in America in the last couple of years which I think have worked. One was the clip of it's gone out of my head, the fashy haircut.
And Milo Yiannopoulos?
Not Milo. Spencer.
Richard Spencer,
Punch and nuts. I thought that was a really sharp piece of political propaganda. But it's a really sharp piece of political propaganda for reasons which aren't obvious, and that's actually worth pausing a bit and watching and understanding, because, people may try and replicate it. The reason why it's such a sharp piece of political propaganda is that, as I saw it, what was going on is Spencer's confronted by people on the street, and he says to they say to me, "You neo-Nazi." He smirks and says, "No." "Do you like black people?" And he grimaces and smirks and does all sorts of visual face moving all over the place and says, "Of course, don't have a problem with black people." And then he's punched. That would not have worked as a piece of visual imagery without the 20 or 30 seconds that preceded it. The 20 or 30 seconds which preceded it explain the story. I've shown it to people who are under 10 and they knew exactly what was going on and they could see it in that moment. And so it's a really effective piece of political propaganda. No one, as far as I know, was saying afterwards, "Oh, you were taking away his right to free speech." But the reason why they weren't is that in that moment, in that specific context, the image worked. Another thing which worked brilliantly was anti-fascists turning out against the far right at Charlottesville. The reason why it worked was because of this process of convergence on the right, this process of Trump deliberately wanting to have allies on the outright, but also Trump wanting to be the conventional Republican politician. And that sense, therefore, that he's riding two horses at once, and those two horses point in opposite directions. And again, an awful lot of people just get that. So at the moment where people see for themselves that it was outright, who took the streets, outright, who killed someone who had the outright, who used violence, at that stage, all the tactics, all the conventional, ordinary tactics to the left, if the right demonstrates, if it's a violent far right that uses violence and you have to demonstrate against them, you actually have to try and stop them, that worked perfectly. But it worked for contingent reasons. I think that's kind of the mistake we make here. We underestimate the contingency of tactics that we've tried before. Now, in terms of free speech, I suppose the thing that I'd say is it seems to me that we're in a moment where both on the left and the right, and on the right to a far greater extent than anyone acknowledges, there's an extremely strong habit of passive aggressiveness. Of people just going, right, the way I'm going to justify myself is saying that I'm under attack. And the reason why that we don't want to play into that is because what's going on in the free speech story of the person talking about the woman being interviewed, she's just saying, you're taking away those people's rights, you're removing them, you're denying them the chance to speak, and that offends me. So somehow we have to think of being absolutely insistent that our tactics don't give that impression. But, as a good example of Spencer, they don't have to give that impression so long as they're done cleverly enough.
I think that's a good place for us to leave it. Well, that's it. Thanks very much to David for joining me. I hope to see some of those listening at the demonstration tomorrow. This has been Novara FM on Resonance 104.4 FM. Thank you so much for listening, and we will be back at the same time in the same place next week. Bye-bye.
This show is brought to you by Novara Media. To find articles, videos, and more audio content like this, head to novaramedia.com. If you've particularly enjoyed this podcast and would encourage others to listen to it, why not head to iTunes and, as well as subscribing, leave us a review. Novara Media can exist only thanks to the generosity of our subscribers and supporters. If you have the means, please consider subscribing at support.novaramedia.com. As well as helping us continue to produce regular content, subscribers will also receive priority access to events, as well as promotions throughout the year. For regular updates, follow us on Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. Novara Media for a different politics.